Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this lecture on or talk on language endangerment and revitalization. I will thank Swamy once again for the opportunity given to me to present this talk. That was so nice that you could think of me when you thought of this topic, or I don't know if it was the other way around, and you thought of me and then thought of the topic that you thought I'd do a little justice to. Okay, so I'd like to say that this talk is from a very interested community member perspective, and not a linguistic perspective as such. Okay, but though of course it is a linguistic topic, but it is more from a interested and concerned community member perspective. Okay, so I'd like to start right away with we'll start with language itself and see what it is all about. Very quickly, I'd like to share my screen. I'll share my screen. Okay, so as I said, this is about language and how about language endangerment and how we can go about revitalization. Okay? So language plays such an important role in our lives because we use language to express our thoughts and emotions, to fulfill our needs and wants, and to communicate with the world around us. So when we think of communication, we do so in terms of individual components of language or domains. Okay, I wouldn't like to spend too much time on this, of course. The phonology, which is the study of speech, sound, morphology, the study of rules that govern how morphemes or the minimal meaningful units of language are used in a language. Then there's syntax, which are the rules that pertain to the ways in which words can be combined to form sentences in a language. And then there is semantics, which is the meanings of words and the combination of words into sentences. And pragmatics, which is the rules associated with the use of language in conversation and in broader social situations. Okay, the five basic language domains thus are a part of a continuum which spans the higher order language skills such as discourse, which is again impacted in the pragmatics, by skills in the pragmatics domain. According to David Crystal, the linguist, only 600 of the 6,000 to 7,000 or so languages in the world are safe from the threat of extinction. Okay, so according to one count, about 6,703 languages were spoken in the world in 1996. Okay, of course there are differing views about that. Some studies say 6,000 and odd, and some studies say 7,000 and odd. And of these, 1,000 were spoken in the Americas, 2011 in Africa, 225 in Europe, 165 in Asia, and 120 in the Pacific, including Australia. So about 97% of the world's people speak about 4% of the world's languages, and conversely about 96% of the world's languages are spoken by about 3% of the world's people. A language then, so language endangerment may be a result of external forces, or it could be caused by internal forces. Okay, so we say a language is endangered when it is on a path towards extinction. Okay, So there might be external forces such as military, economic, um, religious, cultural, or educational subjugation, or it may be caused by internal forces like a community's negative attitude towards its own language. And yeah, so now if a language dies, okay, is it such a disaster? Should we be concerned? Okay, I'll tell you why I think we should be concerned. Because language diversity is essential to the human heritage. Uh, each and every language embodies the unique cultural wisdom of a people. The loss of any language is a loss for all humanity. Since language is closely connected uh, to culture, the loss of language almost always is accompanied by social and cultural disruptions. The intangible heritage of all human society is diminished when a language disappears. Okay, we'll talk more about that as we go on. Because each language is uniquely rich. Now, take for example a very simple idiom. Okay, in English, letting the cat out of the bag. It's an idiom which means it tells you something that is it is something that um, yeah, it is an idiom which means telling something that is supposed to be a secret. Okay, and if you did a word to word translation into any other language, you will not be able to communicate that meaning. Okay, so likewise in every Indian language, there are idioms and proverbs across Indian languages where some we have equivalents across language, and there are other languages where in which there are idioms and proverbs which to which there are in which there are no equivalents in any other language. Okay, in Spanish. There is a idiom which means to give a cat for a rabbit, which means to deceive someone about the quality of something. Okay, and likewise, take for in my language, there is an idiom which says, I will say it, though I don't expect anyone to understand it. It says, "Jate laden aangar ghalevanu," which means roughly, not exactly, but close to something like what we have in Hindi. It says, "Apne pair par kuladi marna." But the literal meaning of that idiom is a quarrel that is going. Why bring it onto your own body? Okay, literally translated, it means that. And therefore, you see, um, those concerned about language endangerment recognize the implications of the loss of linguistic diversity, both for the linguistic and social environment generally, and for the academic community, which is devoted to the study of human language as phenomenon. So, in this way, the extinction of a language results in the irrevocable loss of unique cultural, historical, and ecological knowledge. Okay? Each language is a unique expression of the human experience of the world. Thus, the knowledge of any single language may be the key to answering fundamental questions of the future. So every time a language dies, we have even less evidence for understanding patterns in the structure and function of human language, human prehistory, the maintenance of the world's diverse ecosystems. Okay. So, above all, the speakers of the languages may experience the loss of their language as a loss of their original ethnic and cultural identity. Okay. Um, while the language continues to be spoken by at least some of the population, there is a reference point for the rest of the community who do not speak the language very fluently or not at all. It is this emotional connection to language which I believe is one of the most compelling reasons to seek to maintain the widest possible spectrum of linguistic diversity. Okay. Let's look at now when we talk of language, domain is a very important term. And the term domain, it's usually used to denote the social context of interaction. It is the concept of the sociolinguistic domain. The concept itself goes back to the American sociolinguist Joshua Fishman. And speech communities are made up of a number of domains which organize and define social life. So, in that sense, there are the factors. Each domain has distinctive domain-specific factors. That is the topic, there's the setting, and the addressee. And typical domains in a speech community could include family, religion, education, employment, and friendship. So each domain has a distinctive, a domain-specific factor. Okay. Together they make up these domains. As I said, there's this topic, the setting, and the addressee, or in other words, there's the place, there's the role relationship, and the topic. So now, for example, take one very common domain of language use, that is the home. Okay. Domains are named usually for a place or an activity in it. Home then is the place, and then the role relationships include the members of the family and visitors. Okay, so there are a suitable set of topics such as activities of the family, news about family members, meals, and the household. And so a particular variety of language is appropriate to the domain. In a multilingual community, different languages may well be considered appropriate for different domains. And role relationships also might influence the choice of language. For instance, the husband and wife might use one language to talk to one another, and a father and children might use another language. So there are factors of choice in the setting in locale. So the factors are the content or the topic, then there is social distance, then there are other motivational factors. In social distance, again, we have two dimensions. There is the vertical and the horizontal dimension. As I said, the vertical dimensions is the language you choose in the same domain, in the domain of home. As I just said, between the husband and wife. And then there might be, again, different languages, based on how you respect someone who is speaking to you. You show more respect in terms of status, age, or marital status. And the horizontal dimensions refer to the relative closeness of someone with others. Okay, so you tend to use a low code if you're speaking to someone who is close to you in terms of degree of friendship, sex, or ethnic background, and religious background, and so on. Okay, so let's look at domain loss and renouncement. Okay, domain loss can be defined as the loss of ability to communicate in a language on all levels, and that could be because of because of deficiency or further development of the necessary language for specific purposes levels, okay, or resources rather. Okay, I'll give you an example here. Like, for example, speakers of Telugu or speakers of many Indian languages. How many of us actually use the word bathroom? Okay, I haven't really come across anyone saying in Telugu, I guess it is Marugudodi. And so nobody says Marugudodi. I'm afraid he can't take your call. He's in the Marugudodi. No, he's in the bathroom. Okay, so that is the domain laws. And then there is it always domain laws always occurs when and if uh, a language community fails to develop suitable means of communication. Now take for example computer. Okay, more than bathroom, I think computer is a very common word where we don't have it across languages. Okay, so we can distinguish here between conscious and unconscious domain losses. So to the conscious decisions which lead to losses of domain, we can, for instance, assign language policy concerning research in enterprises where English plays a predominant role, and therefore there is domain loss. Internationalizing and globalizing are pleaded as excuses. Okay, and we can see that this anglifying tendency is in contrast to the intentions expressed in the descriptions of the aims concerned with language planning. Okay, so here the preservation and development of national languages for the spheres of life are important, are of central importance. Then there is an unconscious loss of domain on a different level. Like take for example, the loss in the proficiency of languages like Latin or in the Indian context, Sanskrit. Okay. Um, so, domain renouncement, we can say it's the voluntary or the forced abandonment of the possibility of using one's first language or native language in all communicative contexts. Uh, in this context, I would also like to touch upon the language of religion. Okay, because I mentioned Sanskrit just now. So in the language of religion, okay, language of religion, the term itself is as elusive, or as the concept of religion itself, and it can be understood differently in within different disciplines. For example, sociolinguists treat language of religion as a register of a natural language, which they perceive as a system or a resources or a resource. And in linguist view, it's what separates language of religion from its non-religious counterpart is the selection of the linguistic material, which is at different levels, be it lexical, syntactic, phonological, semantic, or stylistic. Okay, so that is in their religious register. Okay, a theologian, on the other hand, may treat language of religion as a construct of thoughts, which is different from its non-religious counterpart. Okay, and for sociolinguists, the change and the conflict would imply the change and the conflict in the choice of the linguistic code, the linguistic repertoire of the speech community, and the linguistic structure. Okay, so here it is important to note that the extent and the nature of the impact of the sociocultural change on languages and religions and the accommodation of the change would crucially depend on the extent of the variability in the correlation between a particular language and the religion expressed by it. Like, for example, take the relationship between Islam, okay, in the religious meaning, and the Arabic language, which is the linguistic code. This is relatively invariable compared to Islam. Generally, you said Islam means Arabic, but Hinduism, there is a high degree of variability because In Hinduism, it is invariable. The high degree of variability of languages, like there is Sanskrit, there is Hindi, there is Bangla, there is Tamil, and so on, which is the language of religion. So the impact of change in the sociocultural setting on the languages of Islam and of Hinduism will not be the same. Okay, so there is this difference. So for an understanding of this change of language of religion, it is necessary um, for the framework of sociology of religion to take into account the perspectives of linguists as well. Okay, this is not quite related, but I have gone a little tangent because this is interesting to see how language is lost. Okay. Now, what are the major evaluative factors of language vitality? First, there is intergenerational language transmission. Okay, what we mean by intergenerational language transmission is the language passed from generation to generation. Okay, next is the absolute number of speakers. Okay, so and then next there is the proportion of speakers within the total population. Next are the trends in existing language domains. As I said, now take for example computer. Okay, do we have vocabulary for computer related, IT related terms in the language? Okay, and likewise response to new domains and media, and then materials for language education and literacy. Okay, as we go on, I'll tell you what I mean by all these. Okay, let's look at language endangerment itself. Okay, so language endangerment is a matter of degree. Okay, so at one end of the scale, you have languages that are vigorous and even perhaps expanding in numbers, and numbers of speakers or of functional users of language. But still, even these so-called vigorous language exist under the shadow of some more dominant language. Like take, for example, I'll again come to our regional language here, Telugu. It is seemingly a robust language, okay? But it still is, it still exists under the shadow of a more dominant language, that is English, okay? Like I just gave you that example about bathroom and things like that. So on the other end, you have languages that are on the verge of extinction. Okay, excuse me. And in between, of course, there are many degrees of greater or lesser vitality. Okay, language endangerment is a serious concern to which linguists and language planners have turned their attention to in the last several decades, for a variety of reasons. Speakers of many smaller languages, less dominant languages, stop using their heritage language and begin using another. Parents may begin to use only that second language with their children, and gradually the intergenerational transmission of that heritage language is reduced, and slowly it ceases to exist. Okay. Let's look at the two dimensions to the characterization of endangerment. Endangerment, the first dimension is the number of users who identify with a particular language, and the number and the nature of the uses or the functions for which the language is employed. Okay, a language may be endangered because there are fewer and fewer people who claim the language as their own, and therefore neither use it nor pass it on to their children. Alternately, it may be endangered because it is being used for fewer and fewer daily activities, and so it characteristically loses it loses close association of the language with particular social and communicative functions. Okay, so in this way, language endangerment can happen. Um, so the concern about language endangerment is centered first and foremost around the factors which motivate speakers to abandon their language and the social and psychological consequences of language death for the community of the former speakers of that language. So, what are the indicators of language endangerment? Okay, you can see that the best way to identify the level of vitality of a language is not has never been very clear. Okay, but three main criteria are used as guidelines. First is the number of speakers currently living. Second, we have the mean age of the speakers. And then third, we have the percentage of the youngest generation acquiring fluency with the language in question. So UNESCO's ad hoc expert group's definition is that when its speakers cease to use it in an increasingly reduced number of communicative domains and cease to pass it on from one generation to the next. So that means that there are no new speakers, adults, or children. That is when it is indicative of language death. So, as a rule of thumb, we can say that a language is endangered when the children in a community are being spoken to in a language other than that of their parents. Okay. Or the children may understand their parents' language but will not be able to speak it fluently. Okay. So, in that sense, they are passive bilinguals. The language is then lost to the children as they will not be able to speak or understand it at all. And then it can lead to a situation where grandparents and grandchildren speak totally different languages and sometimes cannot effectively communicate with each other. Okay, that is one scale of endangerment. However, there are several other factors which are involved in the endangerment of languages. Okay, not just these three rules of thumb that we have looked at. Okay, so a more complete scale would be something like first you start with age. Okay, so if the number of speakers is evenly spread throughout the speaker population, meaning the youngest child also acquires the language and the older speaker also speaks the language. Okay, and then you have demographics, where the higher the number of speakers and the higher the number of native speakers and the higher the number of speakers who consider their language as an essential part of their identity. Then you have language use. Okay, is it a predominant language used in the home, a language in public encounters, in recreation, in the market, the use at work, at religious gatherings, use in commerce, in formal education, in mass media, and so on and so forth. Then you have language cultivation, development, literacy, and education. Is there ongoing transmission of oral literature? Is there a practical orthography existing? And are there standardized materials like dictionaries? And is there a significant body of print literature? And is there the existence of mass media materials and elementary education materials, and so on and so forth? Then next, another factor could be the status and recognition. So does the language have any or all kinds of official and semi-official recognition. Okay? And then there are attitudes. Do the community members itself positively value their own language? And then there is the amount and quality of documentation. So again, here would come the word list, the dictionaries, audio video recordings, grammatical descriptions, bilingual dictionaries, text collections, and so on. Yeah. So let's look at the levels of endangerment. Okay. UNESCO distinguishes 4 levels of endangerment in languages based on intergenerational transfer. So the first is vulnerable, so a language at risk. Then there is definitely endangered. Okay, when it's vulnerable, most children speak the language, but it might be restricted to certain domains like home. Okay, definitely endangered is children no longer learn the language as a mother tongue in the home. Severely endangered is the language is spoken by grandparents and older generations, while the parent generation may understand it but do not speak it to the children or among themselves. And critically endangered is when the younger speakers are grandparents and older, um, and they speak the language partially and infrequently. Okay? And of course, extinct is when the language is dead. So now let's look at the types of causes. Okay, there are causes that, there are 4 main types of causes. So there are firstly causes that put the population that speak the language in physical danger, like for example, natural disasters, famine, disease. Okay, so the next is war and genocide, like examples of languages of the indigenous populations who are wiped out by colonialists and causes like that. And then there is political repression. This happens when nation states working to promote a single national culture limit the opportunities for using minority languages. Like you can see the most Indian languages in the United States. Okay, so they were limited. They were not given the opportunities to speak their minority language in the public sphere, be it the school, the media, or sometimes, they are prohibited from speaking it altogether. Okay. Then there are cultural, political, economic marginalization and hegemonies. This happens when the political and economical power is closely tied to a particular language and culture, so that there is a strong incentive for people to abandon their language in favor of another more prestigious one. This frequently happens when indigenous populations, in order to acquire a higher political status, adopt the cultural and the linguistic traits of people who have come to dominate them through colonization or conquest or invasion. Okay. This is a very common cause of language endangerment. Okay. So what are the factors contributing to endangerment? Firstly, again, intermarriage. Okay, this we can see a lot of it is happening even in our own country. Marriages or partnerships where one parent speaks a minority language and the other one speaks a majority language can have a negative influence in the retention of the minority tongue by the children. Okay, the tendency obviously is to adopt the majority language. Okay, then there are market forces. The choice of language reflects the working of the market. So naturally, people will choose a market, a language that will benefit them in the long run. Okay. So in such cases, language shift is in the minority group is inevitable. when the language of the minority is seen as a language which does not help the speakers to improve their socioeconomic status or social mobility. Okay, so the minority group will naturally shift to the dominant language. Then there is migration. Okay, migration is when it could be voluntary or it could be forced. That is definitely a cause for language shift. Okay, when members of a language community migrate, they might not, they decrease in size and they might not be able to maintain their language. Another possible cause for language shift is when there is very little difference in terms of lifestyle, custom, and culture between the majority and the minority language community. Then the minority community tends to assimilate the language of the majority community. And there are national education policies where the policy is because the sub-ethnic languages are not giving attention in all education policies by the government. And then there is modernization. When industrialization comes to areas where minority languages are spoken, it is the majority language that is used to train the employees and in the new plants or factories. And it is the majority language which is used as a lingua franca. Next, we have the attitudes. That's a very important factor which leads to languages become endangered, because parents today encourage their children to learn languages of wider communication instead of their heritage language due to the globalization of the world. So it is nowadays it is more likely for children to succeed if they are able to speak the popular languages of the world in order to obtain jobs and for better prospects. One major factor that affects the survival of minority languages is the attitudes of the majority language speakers with whom the minority language speakers cohabit on a given territory. So then the disadvantaged language group is left with no choice but to renounce their language or renounce their social ambitions, okay, depending on whether they are assimilating or resisting the majority language. Okay. It has also been suggested by some that in the modern world, there simply may not be enough room for many languages. Okay. And so languages do not literally die or go, okay, go extinct, since they are not living organisms. So it is, we can say that there are three key factors in the language being replaced by another on this level. First is the status, the associate power a language has, its prestige, its association with the elite groups in society, and its distribution and its demography. Okay. And yeah, let's look at the Indian linguistic situation. According to the census in 1961, India had around 1,652 languages. And but by 1971, only 808 languages remained. And according to the People's Linguistic Survey of India in 2013, around 220 languages have been lost in the last 50 years. So every 2 weeks, it is said that a language dies, and with it, a wealth of knowledge dies forever. So in India alone, there exist now more than 780 languages. And as we can see, there are about 220 languages been lost in the past 50 years. In India, there exists, yeah, as I said, 197. In Indian, 197 languages are categorized as endangered. See, this number is not, it is quite deceptive. And out of these 197 languages, only 2 languages, Boro and Methi, have official status. Okay? This is because, let's see the reasons here. The government of India currently defines a language as one that is marked by a script. Therefore, the government recognizes only 122 languages. But in reality, there are many, many more. Okay. And it is very difficult to make that distinction between a language and a dialect. Okay. And therefore, we have lost out on the numbers. The government of India, again, doesn't recognize any language with less than 10,000 speakers. Okay. And in and out migration of communities. Okay, yeah. So, but the UNESCO has recognized 42 Indian languages as critically endangered. So, as I said, the Government of India does not recognize languages with less than 10,000 speakers. And then the causes for decline are, again, there is migration of communities, which leads to dispersal and of traditional settlements. And then there is a changing employment pattern which favors the majority language. Then there are changes in social and cultural values. And there is a growth of individualism, which puts self-interest over that of community. And then there is encroachment of materialism in traditional communities, which doesn't allow spiritual, moral, and ethical values, which are being overshadowed by consumerism. Okay. According to the People's Linguistic Survey of India, India is one of the 4 countries, along with Nigeria, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, with the largest number of living languages. The endangered languages of India largely lack accessibility tools. On the other hand, India's internet user population is growing by leaps and bounds. Okay, so yeah. So what are the causes for decline? We just looked at. Okay, so what needs to be done? What needs to be done is there could be a scheme for protection and preservation of endangered languages, which is a proven method to ensure the survival of language in the development of schools that teach these languages, these minority languages, and which will be able to help enrich and preserve these languages. And then there could be a vast digital project which can be launched on the lines of the Project Tiger for preserving and growing India's endangered languages. Next, there could be audiovisual documentation of the important aspects of language like storytelling, folk literature, and history. And then there could be initiatives like global language hotspots, which can be enhanced, which can enhance such documentation methods and efforts. Okay, so what actually has been done? Let us see. The government of India is running a scheme which is known as the Protection and Preservation of Endangered Languages. This was instituted by the Ministry of Human Resource Development and in the year 2013. And the objective was to document and archive the country's languages that have become endangered and are at risk of becoming endangered. This is monitored by the Central Institute of Indian Languages, that is the CIIL, which is located in Mysore in Karnataka. So the purpose of that, of it is to coordinate the development of Indian languages, to bring about the essential unity of Indian languages, and to promote interdisciplinary research, and to contribute to mutual enrichment of languages and towards the emotional integration of the people of India. It also aims to protect and document minority, and tribal languages. So let's look at what must be done. There are a few vital things that can be done or must be done to preserve dying languages. So the creation of audiovisual documentation of some of the most important sociocultural aspects of the language, such as storytelling, folk literature, oral literature, and history, can be a start. Okay, and then there are languages that are dying, which need digital activism to grow educational and accessibility tools. Next, documentation in audiovisual forms. Okay, this is there are several cultural aspects like storytelling, folk songs, other narratives like cooking, local festival celebrations, and performing art forms, and so on, that can be documented in audiovisual forms. Okay, thanks to cheaper smartphones and an ocean of free and open source software, one can today record audio, take pictures, and shoot videos in really good quality without spending anything on gears. Okay. So building on these resources might not result in transforming the state of many endangered languages quickly, but it will certainly help in gradually bettering the way people are able to access knowledge in their own language. Let's come to the role of the speech community. The speakers, obviously, and not the outsiders, maintain or abandon languages. Okay, now let's look at what it does feel to speak a language with fewer speakers. Okay, for people like me who belong to a pre-literate community of between 4 and 5 lakh speakers spread over 7 states of India and in a few foreign countries, it means to feel isolated and to rarely have an opportunity to speak my native language. It means to be nearly invisible, surrounded by speakers of other languages, other dominant languages, who do not acknowledge you, who do not even acknowledge yours, let alone have heard of your language. Okay? So speakers in these situations tend to forget words, idioms, and proverbs and grammatical rules due to lack of practice. So in all parts of the world, the members of ethno-linguistic minorities are increasingly abandoning their languages, their native languages, in favor of the more dominant languages. And the forces acting upon a minority language community may be such that a shift to the overarching variety becomes inevitable. Okay, in such circumstances, it may indeed make economic sense for minority language speakers to shift to the majority language for the sake of future generations, if nothing else. And I think it is important that we refrain from making value judgments about such decisions. Who does not want to see his or her own children benefit from modernization? So, culturally speaking, of course, the loss of the communicative use of a minority language may weaken the sense of group identity a language community has. But it should be noted that a language that is no longer regularly spoken may yet have a role to play in the maintenance of group boundaries. Okay, we see that in India a lot. So, among ethno-linguistic communities, a variety of opinions on the future prospects of their languages can be observed. Some of the speakers of endangered languages come to consider their own language as backward and impractical. And such negative views are often directly related to the socio-economic pressure of a dominant speech community. And there are other speakers of endangered languages who attempt to directly counter these threats to their language and commit themselves to the stabilization and revitalization activities. And in the end, it is the speakers, not the outsiders, who maintain or abandon languages. Still, if communities ask for support to reinforce their threatened languages, language specialists should make their skills available and work with these ethno-linguistic minorities. So what can be done? What can be done is um, they, the speech community members, as I said, react differently to language endangerment, but so do linguists and educators and activists who request for assistance by the speech communities. So, such requests could include firstly basic linguistic and pedagogical training, which is providing language teachers with training in basic linguistics. And then there is sustainable development in literacy and local documentation skills. Then there could be supporting and developing national language policy and um, meaning to say that national language policies must support diversity, including endangered languages. And then there could be supporting and developing educational policy in the educational sector. We can see a number of linguists are engaged in implementing increasingly popular mother tongue education programs. Though these so-called mother tongue education um, programs or the so-called mother tongue education does not refer to education in the ancestral language of these endangered communities, but rather to the teaching of these languages in school subjects. Okay. So we can see that finally, raising awareness about language loss and language diversity is can be successful only when meaningful contemporary roles for minority languages can be established. In many cases, community members abandon their language because they believe that there is no other alternative or because they do not have enough knowledge about the long-term consequences of the choices they make. Because people in such a situation are often presented with an either or choice. Okay, either you cling to your mother tongue and identity, but don't get a job, maybe, or you leave your language and you have better chances in life. Okay. So, actually, maintaining and using both languages allows better chances in life. As we can see in ELT theory, when we talk of bilingualism, excuse me, we can see that it is always better to be bilingual. So, when languages have an unequal power relationship, the members of the subordinate group usually speak both the native language and the dominant language. And then only gradually, they speakers sometimes gradually come to use only the dominant language. On the other hand, the subordinate group may resist linguistic domination and mobilize its members to revitalize or fortify its language. And then there are some strategies for such linguistic activism. of which there is language revival, which is reintroducing the language that has been limited for some time, like, for example, Sanskrit. Then there is language fortification, which is increasing the presence of non-dominant language to counterbalance a perceived linguistic threat from a dominant language. And then language maintenance, where where we support the stable use in speaking and in writing of the non-dominant language in a region or state with both multilingualism and a dominant language. Okay. So in conclusion, I would like to say that we all share the responsibility of ensuring that no languages will disappear and that all languages will be maintained and perpetuated into the future generations. I'd like to also mention that this was part of a paper that I presented in the linguistic symposium at the University of Wisconsin in the USA. And it was a wonderful opportunity to see the concern that people all over the world had for language death and for language revitalization. Okay. I hope some of you at least found this interesting. Thank you very much. Yes, Swamy, thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen.